It all started with an old retired couple having a cup of tea on a lazy, sunny Sunday afternoon in a sleepy village south of London. Then it started to rain, and boy did it rain. It rained trouble. But before we get into a boring weather forecast, I'd better tell you about the riot in the other dimension. Not a lot of people know about this, but sharing our world are a race of strange dog-like creatures that walk upright on two legs. They call themselves Gromes. We can't see them because they live in another dimension, nor can they see us. We can't feel them or even sense that they are there, but they are. If ever you've seen a Briard, which is a French sheepdog, then you will begin to understand what they look like. Normally, they have long black hair, but some have dark brown, and those with dark brown hair think they are superior to the others. They haven't reached our technical or evolutionary stage yet, but they seem to have similar thought patterns to our race. I think I know where they get these notions. This may seem a bit strange to some younger people reading this book, but all our films used to be shown in black and white. There were no colour films. You might remember some. Top Hat, starring Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, for example. Now, they were dancing heroes long before Strictly was even thought about. Now, the first films in black and white were projected just over 100 years ago, if I remember rightly. Not that I'm that old, it's just history. There were no cars around 150 years ago, and this is the sort of world that the Gromes still live in. They are slightly behind us in technology. Before films started to be projected onto white screens in our world, the Gromes just thought of the sun and the moon as their gods. However, a strange phenomenon happened in the Gromes world when we started projecting black and white films. For some unknown reason, the Gromes could see the images projected in our world on our white screens in theirs. At first, these images didn't make any noise. Silent movies. But then along came the talkies. These images of otherworldly beings moved their mouths, and instead of some kind of guttural speech, barking and growling, which was how the Gromes communicated, a strange language seemed to be spoken. Now, because the Gromes were a simple race, they thought that these images were gods and started to worship them. The brown-haired Gromes started to learn the language of these gods, which of course was mostly English. This made them feel even more superior. Getting back to the riot that I promised you, it took place in a wooden construction which was built around some of these godly images that used to appear regularly every Sunday afternoon. The images of the gods that appeared here were mostly those images which were created when movies about dancing were projected. More specifically, they usually showed marvellous images of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, who were themselves practically gods to the Strictly stars on TV today. These images of the Gromes gods appeared at around head height and were relatively small in size. In other parts of the Gromes world, somewhere we called America, enormous images of their gods appeared almost in the sky. These places, where the enormous images were seen on a regular basis, were called drive-ins in our world. In America, young people drove to the cinema, and because they were just too lazy to get out of their cars and queue up like respectable English folk did, then go into the cinema, the Americans had to build great big screens outside. These drive-ins had to provide adequate parking spaces for their enormous gas-guzzling cars, where the American youths would sit and wait until enormous hamburgers were delivered to their car windows, and only then would it seem that they could enjoy a movie. Many of the Gromes in this riot were dressed in top hat and tails. Not the doggy variety. Although the Gromes did all have tails, their tails stuck out between the two tails of their tailcoats. I hope this is not confusing you. The Gromes wore this sort of clothing to go and see the images of their gods. You could call it their Sunday best. Meanwhile, back in the sleepy village just to the south of London, when it started to rain, Mr. and Mrs. Rumstuck decided to go inside with their cup of tea. "Which one would you like to watch this afternoon, honey?" said Mr. Rumstuck, known as Ted to his wife, and who was rather tall. They both said in unison, "Top Hat." "How did I know that?" said Ted. "Because it's my favourite, you old chump, as you well know. Anyway, it feels like a top hat day today." So they went down to their basement, which they had made into a home cinema room, complete with 4 armchairs in case they had guests, a projector, and a home popcorn maker. They watched a film in their basement most Sunday afternoons. "Why does it feel like a top hat day, honey bunny?" said Ted. "Because we are finally going to get the gun that we need to rob the bank," said Mrs. Rumstuck, known as Rosie to her husband, and who was rather short. "So we can finally achieve our last wish, realise our dream." Now, I should probably fill you in on what was going on in the old couple's life before the riot in the Gromes world. In other words, a little bit of background information here would probably help you understand why they needed a gun. After all, it was highly unusual for an old couple in a sleepy English village to want to rob a bank at gunpoint, or any other point for that matter. As it so happens, Mr. and Mrs. Rumstuck are passionate about ballroom dancing. Over the years, they have competed in many competitions and accumulated numerous medals and trophies because they are very good at it. Unfortunately, as they got older, they were less likely to win the competitions they entered because younger people were learning to dance and taking part in the same competitions as they were. They searched around England to find dance competitions for older people, but it was useless. There were none around in the 1950s when Mr. and Mrs. Rumstuck were searching. It was 1955, and they were on the verge of giving up on their dream of winning one more competition when they happened to have some visitors from the States who told them about an annual ballroom dancing competition for senior citizens in Los Angeles. It was called the Ballroom Blitz, and it had a very generous cash prize. Their ambition, their dream, started to take shape. They would go on holiday to America, and whilst there, take part in their final competition. This was all fine, until they had a good look at their finances. They didn't have anywhere near enough money saved to go on such an expensive trip. It wasn't like nowadays when you can jump on a plane tomorrow and whiz off to the States for the price of a couple of weeks' wages. The accepted thing then was to travel over the Atlantic on an ocean-going liner like the Queen Mary, and that's not cheap. So they decided to get a bank loan. It should be easy, they thought. After all, they owned their house and both had good pensions. Simple. They got turned down. Once by the village bank. It was too small a bank, they said, to take the risk. Then they got turned down by the town bank because, of all things, They were considered to be too old. They might die before they paid back the loan. What a cheek! Couldn't the bank manager see how fit and healthy they were? Revenge was considered. That's when Mrs. Rumstuck, née Goldberg, of American birth, had the great idea, having seen too many American gangster films, of robbing the bank that turned them down. Back at the riot in the world of the Gromes, the brown-haired ones, who were dressed like priests from our world in order to make them feel even more superior than they actually felt, they even went as far as wearing dog collars. Dog collars? Get it? Were standing in front of the flickering images of their so-called gods. Also standing up was a group of modernist Gromes, who were, as usual, questioning the brown-haired one's wisdom. The brown-haired ones were talking, as usual, about the virtues of ballroom dancing every day in order to please the gods. The modernists were saying that their kind of music, rock and roll, was more enjoyable and easier to dance to. You see, everyone in Gromeland had to learn to ballroom dance and speak English at school as part of the religious syllabus. So why was there a riot about to take place? Well, it was disillusionment with the establishment, of course. Let me explain something. You have to remember the Gromes had started to worship the black and white figures that kept appearing in their world, as if they were gods. Remember also that the Gromes' technology was like ours in the early 1800s. And so, when they saw what marvels these figures had in their world, cars, telephones, steam engines, electricity and lots more, it really did seem like we were gods. It also gave the Gromes all sorts of good ideas as to how to improve their own lives. Their lives were more or less wrapped around farming, growing food to eat, harvesting, and work such as this. So, whilst at the beginning, when the images started appearing, they became more frequent as more and more people in our world watch movies, with the arrival of colour movies, black and white ones started to appear less and less in the Gromes world. You see, for some technical reasons, the Gromes were not able to see the images made by colour movies. So, the so-called gods were appearing to the worshippers less and less. Hence, doubt was creeping into the Gromes society about the true nature of the images. Incidentally, colour was banned in the Gromes world. They had colour in their lives before the black and white images started to appear, but after that, because their gods didn't have colour in their world, it was thought to be sacrilegious to wear any clothing that was coloured or have anything in their houses painted in anything apart from black and white. When the ban was first introduced, there were a few Gromes who ignored it and carried on wearing coloured clothing, but they were growled at, then snarled at, and even sometimes had stones thrown at them. Gromes who had colour in their homes were arrested in a rage of religious fervour. As the images of the gods started to disappear, colour started to creep ever so slowly back into Grome life. The modernists, for example, would often have a coloured handkerchief that they showed off when no one was looking. Colour was still frowned upon generally, but it was really bad when it was shown in front of images of the gods when they appeared. Hence, when one of the modernists accidentally exposed a corner of his coloured handkerchief whilst arguing with the brown-haired ones, there was pandemonium and panic. Voices and gentlemen's walking canes were raised. Arguments about the gods forsaking the Gromes got heated. Even sacrilegious thoughts that the images were false gods were raised. I'm getting overexcited at the riotous goings-on, and I expect you are too. So I shall return for a few minutes to the calm of our world, to the time just before Mr. Rumstuck went out looking for the gun. After Mrs. Rumstuck, Rosie to us from now on, had come up with the idea of robbing the bank, and Mr. Rumstuck, Ted to us from now on, immediately had a very mild heart attack because they had started to discuss the possibility of actually doing it. I think Ted's mild heart attack was only him pretending, really. He clutched his chest around where he thought his heart should be and staggered around the kitchen, gasping for breath in mock agony for a few seconds. He seemed to recover very quickly after he treated himself to a shot of neat brandy, which he said was purely for medicinal purposes only. Rosie frowned on this activity, as she always had done. Anything Ted did for fun, or anything to do with Ted drinking alcohol, Rosie seemed to frown upon more and more in their later years. Perhaps this is what happens when people get older. Some of them adopt a holier-than-thou attitude against a lot of things that they used to enjoy. Strange, that. Now look, Ted, stop messing around, for heaven's sake. Do you have to drink that stuff? It'll cloud your brain. That's if you've got one. Now think. There's so much to talk about. We have to make a plan that is foolproof. That means that even you can understand it, says Rosie. Darling, tried Ted. Stop interrupting me when I'm talking. We have to get a gun. Where are you going to get one? Have you any idea how we're going to solve that one? You can't just pop round to the ironmongers and ask, have they got a couple of Colt 45s in stock? And guns don't just grow on trees either, you know. Speak up, Rosie went on. Look, it's up to you. You're the man. I can't do everything. Well? And on she went. Darling, I... mumbled Ted. Sorry, Ted, but you're too slow. If we are going to rob those skinflints in the bank, you'll have to think faster than that. Go and see some of your old military chums from the war. They're bound to know some people who have kept guns as souvenirs, snapped Rosie. I wasn't in the war. I'm too old. Well, not the last one, anyway. And First World War guns are too big, clumsy and unreliable. At last, Ted managed to get a word in. They went on like this for quite a time. Well, to be quite honest, it was Rosie that went on for some time, while poor Ted tried to get another word in. It was eventually decided, by her that should be obeyed, that Ted would go into town and start talking to men in pubs about how he could obtain a gun. In the 50s, it was usually just men who went into pubs on their own. If women went in, it was with a man, and they would sit quietly in a corner talking about inconsequential things like buying another pair of shoes or the shopping that week. Whereas, left to their own devices, men would talk about more important things like politics, world peace and football. So, to avoid any inconsequential conversation, Ted was sent on this mission by Rosie on his own. Ted was not a brave man, but when he got used to the idea of going into a pub without Rosie coming with him, checking on his consumption of alcohol and having a pint or two, even though she told him to stick to halves, he was starting to look forward to it. As it turned out, Ted's mission was much more difficult than Rosie had first thought it would be. Ted had to go into town on many occasions and visit quite a few pubs before he found the right one. Ted came home unsuccessful many times, but despite his lack of progress, he always came home with a smile on his face. I wonder why. After 6 unsuccessful days in a row, Rosie started to get a little suspicious. Not only did Ted come home with a smile on his face, he even looked a little bit tiddly now and then. When questioned about his condition that Saturday night, Ted had to think quickly, which he actually wasn't very good at. All he thought of to say was that he had at last found the right pub, and he could go back there the next day and get what they wanted. So Rosie was almost placated. She even managed a half smile before she sent him to bed to sleep it off. The next day was Sunday, and the day of the riot in the world of the Gromes. Ted woke up late that day with a bit of a hangover, and he decided he couldn't face the pub at lunchtime, so he would go that night instead. This is when Rosie and Ted were having a cup of tea in the garden, and it started to rain. The top hat day. As the argument heated up, a sharp-eyed Grome at the back of the congregation spotted a spot of colour on the corner of one of the modernist Gromes' handkerchiefs, which was hanging out of his top pocket. He shouted out, "Blasphemy!" and all hell broke loose, if you'll pardon the expression. 50 or so Gromes from the back started to push forward to join in with the argument at the front. The 4 friends at the front were getting pushed towards the brown-haired Gromes, who were standing in front of the images. The brown-haired ones started to get worried. They saw what was happening at the back. Walking sticks were being waved angrily about. Gromes were growling and snarling. It was turning nasty. The mob was pushing forward to get at the 4 modernists at the front. The brown-haired ones knew that they weren't going to be able to hold the mob back, and that the 4 at the front were getting dangerously close to the flickering images of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rodgers. No one in Gromeland had ever tried to touch the images of their gods. It was thought to be either too dangerous or sacrilegious. Meanwhile, in their basement projection room, Mr. and Mrs. Rumstuck had got to the point in Top Hat where there was a big production dance number led by Fred Astaire and Ginger Rodgers. At this point in the film, they sometimes got up out of their armchairs and danced to this big number. This was a top hat day, as Rosie called it, and she was happy. So she pulled Ted up and they started to dance. The brown-haired Gromes shouted out a warning to the advancing mob to stop pushing forward, as Gromes were getting too close to the images of the gods. The 4 friends at the front, who had their backs to the images, didn't realise how close they were to the danger. They were concentrating on avoiding several waving walking sticks. At the last second, the brown-haired Gromes all stepped aside to avoid being pushed into their gods. This did not help the fate of our 4 friends. They were pushed into the images. There was a loud explosion and a blinding flash of light, and our 4 friends went into the flickering images and disappeared. All the other Gromes jumped backwards away from the images and stopped shouting. The 4 modernists were gone, seemingly consumed by the anger of the gods. The brown-haired ones looked gingerly behind the flickering images, which still seemed to have many lightning flashes erupting around them, just to check that they had indeed disappeared. And they had.